So my little role in today's event is to talk to you about what we're doing within the Missing Salmon Alliance, and specifically how we are going about trying to support efforts for conserving this species by looking at a wider ecosystem approach, looking at a wider life cycle approach, and developing effective tools to help managers to do their job. Specifically, I'm going to highlight three parts of our work programme. One is in mobilising knowledge. I think we've all been hearing over the last 24 hours how important it is for us to use knowledge more effectively. There's a huge amount of information out there. How do we harvest that? How do we start to use it in a better way so that we can guide our actions for the future? We're also doing our own targeted strategic research into particular parts of the life cycle that Phil nicely set me up with his talk there, talking about the early marine phase of life and how critical that is for determining the overall survival of the fish. So we're looking in that area as well. And lastly, I'll touch on how we're starting to develop some new management support tools. How do we start to pull this together? How do we start to think about this really difficult space of translating research into guiding actions of the future? So we've been hearing how our salmonscape is changing, how we've got a changing environment, we've got multiple environments that salmon are inhabiting, and we need to do better at responding to those changes and how we move into the future. Now, we can't prescribe what they would be at this stage, but we need to know as much as possible about the current situation that salmon are facing and to be able to predict to the best of our abilities what these changes are going to be. So the salmon, the life cycle is complex, as we've been hearing. 120 different life strategies, I think the 10, is that right? Jaco, just incredible amount of complexity there. But we know there are pressures, we know there are issues, we know there are things that are happening along the way at different stages in the life of the salmon. And they're going to have different effects. We have got a lot of information on them, but actually we haven't really pulled all this together very well yet to give us the guidance and the management guidance for the future. We also know that we have particular levers that management can use to try and effect some positive changes. But where these management levers are in the life cycle are not always where the big problems are actually taking place. And we need to be aware of that within the limits of what management can do at this stage. We might be evolving our management actions in the future, but right now, the management actions are very much focused on the production in fresh water. We can look at harvest management. Again, Jaco, not pointing out all the time here, but when you were saying about restricting the fishing on the rivers, that's one aspect of management that can happen. In a lot of rivers, we don't have a harvest anymore. We haven't got that as an option. But we do have options to improve the quality of habitat, the accessibility of habitat. And that's really where a lot of the focus of management actions is on. But really, what we're looking to try and do is to maximize the effectiveness of these levers. Which ones are right? Which ones are the right ones for situations that the stocks are facing? What is the right suite of management actions to do the best we can? How can we use them to address the rates of change that the salmon are facing at the moment? Is it possible? And how can we not just manage the manageable in a way that is the same and static going forwards, but how can we be adaptive? How can we be nimble? How can we use a suite of management tools in the right way to do the best thing we can for salmon? So, what do we need to do? What we really need to do is we really need to try and find out how to turn up that dial on the lower right there as well as possible in an area of the life cycle that we can do something about to try and compensate for an area of the life cycle where it might be very much harder to do something about the losses. Now, the practicalities of that are extremely complex, but as a kind of schematic to think about, we can start to partition out where we're losing fish. We can start to think about mechanisms involved. We can start to think about where we have real practical options for doing management. And can we start to turn that dial in a way that actually starts to balance things up, where we're having more losses? Can we do something about that? And that's really what this whole program that I'm involved in is about, trying to unravel and give information that can help guide this process into the future? Can we start to turn that dial the right amount and using the right tools to do that? So we need to understand the processes. We still need to understand the processes. We do not know what these processes are. We need to think about the type of action that's necessary within the suite of the current actions we have. We need to think about the scale of those actions, and also how do they adapt and how do we move forward in a changeable salmonscape. So the program I'm working with is called the Likely Suspects Framework, and Phil mentioned it in one of his slides earlier on. And the key aims of this program are to help us to build a better picture of how the salmon interacts in its environment. Not just the salmon, but the other interacting components, the physical, the biological components, using information to the best of our ability to help us guide actions of the future. And we're focusing really on where and how mortality is occurring. And ultimately, where we want to go with this is we want to try and use that information as well as possible to provide managers with access to better information or better opportunities for them to guide their decision-making in difficult situations. So what kind of information do they need to help them to make these decisions and make the right choices for salmon in their area of management responsibility? So the linking of these two here is this last little part of the sentence is looking at the efficacy of management actions within the context of other factors at play. So having a wider perspective of what's going on within the life cycle is important. It might not be that we can directly do something about an increase in mortality in one part of the life cycle, but if we don't know about it and we don't understand more about what's driving it, how do we know that what we do somewhere else can even come close to compensating or addressing that particular problem? So it's giving a wider life cycle view, or attempting to give that view. So why do we need more work? We need more work. We need more research and more data, because we know there's a vast amount of information out there, and as scientists and people involved in research, we're probably very aware of it. But that doesn't always translate down to management level very well. It is a huge and increasingly huge academic world of publication, and making that accessible at the right scale for management is a challenge. There are still considerable knowledge gaps. We still have big question marks about not only where salmon are spending time, but what is the mechanism that's driving the changes in losses that we're experiencing. And we need to use data to find these drivers of change as much as possible. If we can identify the mechanisms behind what's going on, potentially we don't have to do huge amounts of survey work. Potentially we could be using this information with advances in technology, remote sensing, to do some of the work for us in the future. But we still have to plug these gaps. We still have to go out and find a lot more about what's happening in certain parts of the life cycle. So we started a process about 18 months ago of trying to draw together knowledge, draw together data, and build a unique salmon data library, where we have looked around the global data science world, making use of existing infrastructure, looking at the issues of controlled vocabularies. When is it a smolt? When is it a kelt? When is it a, what did you call it again? Kurt, not a kelt, but something else you had, didn't you? A slink, yeah. So that illustrates the idea that when you come across the salmon sphere, people call things different names. Trying to understand that, control that, use specific terminology to make things accessible across the research community, and ensuring interoperability. So these are some of the people that we've been working with and discussing our building this salmon data library. We've been trying to do it from a perspective not just of the salmon, but of the salmon's environment. The physical environment that they are traveling through, feeding in, the biological elements that contribute to that ecosystem. We've been trying to think about how to organize that data, and it's quite a challenge, as I'm sure you'll agree. There's a huge amount of information and opportunities to harvest information here. Extensive data wrangling has been required to mobilize the data, and we've been going along the principles of data mobilization, which are the FAIR principles of making your information findable, making them accessible, interoperable, and reusable. There's no point in doing this if it's going to sit on the shelf and gather digital dust and not be used. We need it to be used, we need it to be future-proofed, and we need it to be interoperable with a vast amount of knowledge within the realms of the internet. So we started this process. We now have a start. We have now got a resource that people can access and use. We have over 200 different data sets described and in our data frame. They range from physical information, ocean synthesized data sets of empirical data, and we have made a start to try and order them in some way that make them accessible and as a resource for people to use. So each of these little blue markers here identifies a different described data set, mostly metadata, giving information on who to contact, how you get information for it, and we're starting to build it up. And we need the science community to start interacting with this and helping to build this, to make it into a resource that we can hopefully make use of to address big, important questions in the future. So we've also got it so that we can search it by key mortality questions, the big questions that people need to know about. Where are the gaps? What are the factors? What are the things that actually influence survival? So you can select which data are applicable to each of these questions. You can also select which data are applicable to different life stages. And we've tagged all these, made them all searchable and findable within this framework. And the idea behind this is that it should be a growing research resource. It's going to be an organizing framework for information, but also to allow, hopefully, people to focus their work and use existing information without having to spend days, weeks, months trying to find and then mobilize information which could be out there somewhere in numerous different locations. So we're trying to do this as a communal and collaborative effort to help research of the future. So moving on from the actual mobilization of data, and I would again make a plea for people to have a look at this within our Missing Salmon Alliance site and look at what we're trying to produce here and interact with it, give us some feedback. We're always keen to know how to make things better. Why do we need to take this life cycle view? We need to take it for conservation because we need to recognize the extent and speed of changes. It isn't going to be appropriate for us just to keep doing what we've always been doing. We recognize that the situation salmon are in is changing and it is not improving. We need to do something different. We need to think of a game changer here. And also by looking across the life cycle, perhaps we can look for new pieces of information we can use as indicators. Maybe we can look for things that give us a chance to predict what's going to happen with a bit more certainty and a bit more, with a bit more, certainty that we actually are going to be doing the right thing. So these indicators are going to come from looking through the existing data, looking at synthesizing new information, and then having that information to guide us as to what the conditions, whether they're going to be improving or not in the future for salmon. So we can hopefully be looking for indicators across the life cycle in the marine environment, in the freshwater environment. But if we don't start to give this whole life cycle context, then what we do in freshwater doesn't have the ability to ever be given the context of changes. So we could continue to do what we do, thinking we're doing a great job, but if things in the marine environment are changing that we aren't aware of, potentially what we're doing might have no effect, or it might actually be having a detrimental effect in the future. So we need to have that awareness, that context. And that's going to be used to guide new opportunities to take positive action in the future. So this is a very, very simplistic and just a deterministic view on survival changes through the life cycle, looking at the stage changes from either models or from empirical data, and looking at how salmon losses occur during that life cycle. So we could start with a very simple representation and use that, but that wouldn't be applicable for every stock. It certainly wouldn't be applicable for the range of life histories we've been discussing over the last 24 hours. But it's a representation. It gives us a baseline, or something to start off with. How do we go about turning the dial on management actions that's appropriate for particular locations, particular stocks? What do we need to do to build that picture? What do we need to do to build those numbers and give them the right biological realism for them to be actually incredibly useful for management in the future? And that is the challenge, is building this deterministic view into some mechanistic model, something that responds to our knowledge and our increasing knowledge of what's happening to drive these losses. So one thing we're involved in is our own set of strategic research to help fill in these gaps. And it was alluded to in the talk previously by Phil about some acoustic tracking work. And within the Atlantic Salmon Trust at the moment, and within the Missing Salmon Alliance, we've got two very large Scottish acoustic tracking programs, and we also have one that Rasmus talked about for the River Frome down in the Game and Wildlife Conservation-led project. But these tracking projects are getting that information on this really critical life stage, the early marine stage of transition from freshwater into marine proper migration up towards the feeding grounds in Norway. Over 2,000 acoustically tagged fish have been tagged this year in these two programs. We have a couple of representatives of the program here you can speak about the details to maybe afterwards. And an incredibly successful way of gathering information which we can then tie into the conditions these fish are experiencing and give us more information about what is actually happening to them along that journey. Phil showed you this slide earlier. This is from Sea Monitor, one of the partners on that program. Some of the tags that were recovered from gliders off the continental shelf, off the Western Isles of Scotland, and some of the locations they were tagged in. So we now have really good information on individual movements in these areas, which are prone to pressures such as aquaculture and marine developments and other things going on. So we're starting to plug these gaps and build information specific to particular stocks. And again, Phil, going back to you again, paper that you guys have just published, looking at where fish are in the marine environment. So we've got a really good and growing information as to where fish are spending time, but what conditions and pressures are they experiencing along the way? That to us is, and to the growing science community, is the key here. How do we start to unravel what's happening to these fish? We need to know where they are, but we need to know what's happening. And we need to move towards understanding the mechanisms behind it. And to do that, we need to kind of delve deep into what's happening within that week that the fish are in particular areas, or within a very specific time period that they are moving through these critical zones. So we're building within our team. We've got a partnership with Strathclyde University and some statisticians and modelers there that are building the salmon's eye view along this critical migration, specifically starting with this western migration route up the Irish and UK coast, along the continental shelf. So starting to plot that out, thinking about it in terms of units and times and specific parcels of time that fish are moving along this migration route, and then thinking about what is the outputs from the current ocean models that we have, the Scottish Shelf model or the AMM7 model here, along this journey, along this distance. What's the temperature range? And we can do this for the past 20 years and start to think about a fish at this location has experienced these conditions in this week over the last 20 years. Now, how does that relate down to their ultimate survival that we know from the index rivers? So we can start to build up a bit more of a granularity in terms of what's happening to fish in this, what seems to be a very wide and seemingly, maybe not a black box type of migration, but it's starting to come down into a bit more of a realistic opportunity to describe what's happening. So we can do it for temperature, we can do it for chlorophyll, we can do it for things that are modelled via these models, but we can also do it looking at the food chain. We're also starting to look at some of our options to look at what fish are eating, specifically looking at the continuous plankton recorder information, which is a fantastic resource. All these lines on this map here, the orange line is our migration route of the fish, but the purple lines here are where we have information on plankton density at the times when these fish are actually in these areas, and they cross these migration routes at particular points. And we can look at them and we can start to say, okay, what's the available food been in those weeks across 20 years? Has it changed a lot? Is it about the nutrients that has, that's driving the food chain? Is that what's responsible for this change in condition factor? Or the graph on the right here, just to throw up here in case, maybe it's not about the actual quantity of food, maybe it's about the timing that the food is available. So this is a graph that shows when sand eels got to a certain size, that they were available, actually a bird study, But again, it shows the idea that over time, things are changing. So it's not just that the density of food might be changing, but also the availability of a particular type of food. Capelin, for example, was talked about as being really important. Sand eels are really important for British and UK fish moving out across this area here. So we've got the ability now to look at the granularity, look at these things, and try and look for the mechanisms behind why salmon are not doing well just now. And if we can do that, we then could potentially have much better predictive power and understanding whether things are going to continue on this downward trajectory. Are they going to level off? Are they going to actually possibly improve for some stocks? That's the kind of information that managers need to give them context for what they do in freshwater. So to do this, the last part of this talk is really just to look at the idea of providing some tools for managers. How do we try and translate that into something managers can interact with, can use, can really start to benefit from this information? And it's not going to be something that's easy. It's going to take a long time to do, but it's something that needs to be done. We've got to do better. We've got to have this translation of complex information in such a way that managers can use it. So we need to take this life cycle. We need to start thinking about where fish are going missing. We need to think about what is responsible for those losses. We need to attribute the losses. We need to think about the mechanisms behind why that is actually taking place. So we've made a start with this. We've taken inspiration from a couple of different sources here. One is the AST's Atlantic Salmon Modeler, which is again a very deterministic impression of what happens in a standard population. Losses, you can start to play about with loss rates to see what happens as a response. So something like that has been incredibly popular and useful for people to get a context to what could happen throughout the life cycle. So taking that as a kind of a guide, and then thinking about, can we start to build in arrays of indicators? This is an example from the Pacific, where there are a number of different trophic levels and potential areas that we know have got a relationship with whether salmon survive or not. Can we start to use this kind of traffic light system in some way that can guide people? Can we use it? Can we build this in? Can we give it in such a way that people can say, okay, let's look at prospects. What's going to happen? How do we know that in the next 5 years, what's going to happen with reasonable confidence? What's going to happen to our stocks? What are the drivers? What are the things that we can actually try and attribute to these changes? So taking these approaches as a kind of starting point, we're building basically a toy model at this stage, a demonstration of how we might start to put this together and give some of the managers some interactive capacity. So this is built in the kind of the R-Shiny environment, where we have a very simple deterministic model to start off with as a toy, as a demonstration. And then we started to think, okay, how do we start to give managers the opportunity to just shift the dial slightly? If we change some of these features, we change things like channel connectivity, water temperature, predation rates. This is a demonstration. It's not got the complexity behind it at the moment, but we wanted to make sure we had something to speak to managers about. Did they like this? Did they like this approach? Is it something they wanted to kind of interact with? Is it something we can give across these different environments in terms of freshwater, estuary, and ocean? Can we start to fill these in? Can we start to build the complexity of the models behind them to give people a chance to use these tools to look at what's going to happen? So we started this off last year. We got some colleagues at the university I work with to build this with us. And now we're at the stage of kind of the next step of how do we start to actually populate this, parameterize it? How do we start to build in the complexity behind it to make it start to have the right kind of realism for managers to use? So we took it out to a kind of a study group of a workshop of salmon managers, UK salmon managers, and asked them, is this going to be useful for you guys? There's no point if it's not. We need to get some feedback. And the feedback was really positive, I must admit. Not entirely positive, but generally positive. Yes, they want this kind of thing. They feel there's a need for it, there's a gap. They want to be able to capture this knowledge to guide decision making much more effectively. They need to have this interactivity and start to think about what the cause and effect of their actions could be. They recognize marine knowledge is important in planning and communications, and they also recognize that they still need to know more about what happens in the freshwater part of the life cycle, even though potentially we've got the most information on that particular phase. But I think we went out to these guys to try and make sure what we were doing and where we were going wasn't diverging from the needs, and we were happy to know that we have got positive feedback from them. So we're moving forward with this, and how can this help salmon? What's it going to do for salmon and salmon management? Hopefully it's going to help by giving managers much more, as the process develops. It's not anywhere near done yet, but it is in process. It'll provide fundamental new knowledge in an accessible form. That's important. It's an accessible way of getting people to interact with this very complex and difficult area. It can help with forecasting, it can help with guidance, and providing guidance that is not just static, it's dynamic and responsive. And that's important too, because the salmon is facing a very dynamic environment. Hopefully, the ambition is that it will allow managers with new what-if testing capacities. It can allow them to think about different scenarios, putting the context of their actions within the life cycle, and supporting new and effective planning for the future. So this is where this likely suspects framework approach is going, and we've made a really good step forward, but we've still got a way to go with it. But in terms of the next steps, where we're going with our program, we are helping the data hub to grow. We're resourcing that. We want to build it. We want to interact with people. We want to get data in. We want to make it something people use and focus in attentions on. We want to focus our attentions on developing a collaborative case study that looks at a key part of the life cycle, some key hypotheses, which is linking up freshwater with the first month or two of marine migration. We're continuing to harvest knowledge and building the life cycle representations, looking at how do we make that complexity, how do we represent it in such a way that people can actually understand it? And that's the challenge here. And by doing that, we hope that we can progress with a suite of management support tools, moving that forward by speaking to managers, making sure we're again not diverging again. And how do we get something they're going to use? How are we going to get something that as an output will make a difference? And that's what this is about. It's about trying to step up and turn that dial in the right direction by using the right sorts of tools that are available now and helping us into the future. Okay, thank you very much.